Women's basketball is in the best shape it's arguably ever been in. WNBA attendance and ratings reached peaks last season, and thanks to stars like Caitlyn Clark, Angel Reese, Paige Beckers, and an all-time run by Dawn Staley South Carolina Gamecocks, the women's NCAA tournament this past season actually outdrew the men's, which is kind of a huge deal. And since the women's college basketball stars of today are the WNBA stars of tomorrow's, it stands to reason that this next wave of stars will be bringing a lot of eyeballs with them to the WNBA in the next couple seasons. Especially Caitlyn Clark, because she is legitimately like one of the biggest American sports stars on the planet right now. But with all these new eyes on the sports comes a host of very, very bad takes. NBA Twitter is honestly a cesspool of bad takes, and that just gets ratcheted up to 11 anytime the women's game is brought up. Mostly because NBA Twitter doesn't actually like basketball, but that is a topic for a different day. Female athletes' pay has been a topic of discussion for a while now. Like, remember when Brittany Griner was locked away in a Russian prison and everyone was like, well, why'd you go over there in the first place? And then we all like collectively learned at the same time that WNBA stars have to go play overseas in like Russia and China and places because they don't actually make that much money in the WNBA. But then like she got released and came back and started playing again, and everyone just stopped caring, and female athletes just went back to being grossly underpaid. Well, this is kind of like that, but this time it is a like straight white girl who doesn't smoke weed getting underpaid, so like the general public actually cares. Now, I want to make it clear that I think it is a good thing that people are talking about women's sports, talking about women's compensation for playing these sports, and so on. But the main problem I have is that a lot of the conversation around this is just flat out wrong. And the worst of this is when you like see a clip of like an air ball or a turnover or something go viral in a WNBA game, and every reply like underneath the tweet is just like, oh, and these girls think they deserve to be paid as much as LeBron James. Like any serious person has ever claimed that that's a thing that should be happening. But that just goes back to the fact that most Twitter arguments are between someone and the voices in their head. Like, yes, it is a good thing for fans to support the WNBA. Going to games, watching games, buying merchandise, anything that you want to do to support the team and, you know, express your fandom for them is a good thing. But the problem is none of those things are going to fix wages in the WNBA, because the amount of money that the league makes isn't really the problem. It's how the money that they do make is distributed that is the real problem. Like, sure, not having finals games on a random Friday afternoon with no media coverage or promotion would probably help, but the increase in revenue seen by that would not actually change the problem with the WNBA, because in reality, the problem is that the WNBA is purposely underpaying its players. Salary caps are this thing that kind of only exist in major American sports. It's sold as a way to kind of like level the playing field, to make sure all like the small bean teams in the middle of nowhere can compete with the big coastal elite franchises like the Lakers and the Knicks. But in reality, it's just a way to put a limit on how much players can earn. Like if you had a free market and opened up free agency for a player like Nikola Jokic, for example, some owner would offer like half the team over to him before it was all said and done. But because of salary cap, he has a max contract, which means he's more or less going to make the same exact number wherever he goes. So the only decision left up to him is if he wants to make $50 million in Denver, or he wants to make like $50 million in Chicago or something like that. Most salary caps are based off a revenue sharing model where the amount of revenue that the league brings in is split between the players and the owners, and that number is usually collectively bargained by the players union and the owners. Obviously, the NBA is the most apt comparison to the WNBA, but pretty much all the major leagues have about the same rev sharing split, around 49-50%, give or take a percentage point here or there between the owners and the players. But how do we get to that point? During the 1970-71 season, the Seattle Supersonics played an average of $45,000 per player, about $630,000 in total, meaning in 1971, the Seattle Supersonics paid roughly 64% of revenue from that season to players, which is actually a significantly higher percentage than NBA teams today. But why is that? Mostly because back then there was a league called the ABA that still existed. Because of the threat of players leaving to go join the rival league, the NBA was forced to properly compensate its players or run the risk of losing their stars to someone who would. And from then on, NBA salaries just continued to rise. By the 1979-80 season, the average NBA salary was $173,500, then up to $189,000 the next season, then all the way up to $218,000 in 1981-82 season. But by 1983, the NBA was in a pretty rough financial state. According to David Dupree of the Washington Post, league sources at the time indicated that there were plenty of teams around the league, including teams like the Utah Jazz, Indiana Pacers, Cleveland Cavaliers, and San Diego, now Los Angeles Clippers. These teams were in such poor financial shape that they were considering mergers among each other or just completely ceasing having a basketball team in that city. That season, the Philadelphia 76ers had a record high payroll, averaging about $400,000 per player, estimated revenue of just under $8.2 million based on average ticket prices at the time and the reported gate for the season. So given that income and their $4.8 million payroll, we see that the 1983 Philadelphia 76ers spent just under 59% of revenue on player salaries at a time when the NBA was on the verge of financial collapse. So what exactly was driving up player salaries during a time when revenues were so far down? Were owners just more generous back then? Did people just care more about basketball in the 80s? Did all the owners just see the bigger picture and decide to come together and pay these players out of the goodness of their heart because they just wanted to fund what would become the National Basketball Association? No, of course not. It was the unions. Prior to 1976, NBA contracts had this thing called a reserve clause. Today, how it works is a player signs a contract. At the end of that contract, they're free to go and negotiate with any team they want to decide where they want to play next. But before 1976, that's not really how it worked. For NFL fans, think of the reserve clause as a never-ending franchise tag without the massive pay bump that you also get from that. Basically, if a player let their contract run down, then the team had the right to re-sign him to a one-year deal of equal value to his previous contract. Basically, if a player let his contract run out, then it didn't matter because the team still owned his rights, which in practice is just basically signing a lifelong contract with an NBA team until they don't want you anymore and take you out back like an old racehorse. This practice completely stagnated wages because player movement wasn't really a thing, and the owners weren't just going to give them a raise when they had no other option but to keep playing for them. If the players just don't have the option to leave their team, then they have no bargaining power during contract negotiations. However, in the mid-70s, NBA players began unionizing. Insert Oscar Robertson. So back in these days, the NBA draft worked a little bit different than how it does today. Nowadays, you have the team with the worst record gets the first pick, and so on and so forth until the end of the draft, and you get to pick which player you want to. Back then, they had what was called a regional draft. Meaning, since Oscar Robertson played college ball at the University of Cincinnati, he just had to go play for the Cincinnati Royals. He didn't really have a choice in the matter. And in only his second year in the league, Robertson would become the first player in NBA history to average a triple-double for an entire season. But Cincinnati still lost in the first round because, honestly, outside of him, the team just kind of sucked. Robertson had aspirations of competing for a championship, but for most of his prime, he was stuck on a middling Cincinnati Royals team with an owner who was just not interested at all in paying for better players to come in to try and compete for the championship. So the NBA Players Union, led by Oscar Robertson, decided to sue the league to outside the reserve clause, claiming that it violated American antitrust laws of the time. And in 1976, the NBA, after settling with the Players Union, abolished the reserve clause, thus creating what we now know as free agency, with the caveat that teams were allowed to match any offer that their players received from another team. This shift in power allowed players to be more fairly compensated on their terms and instantly drove up wages. Because referencing back to the Washington Post article, in 1983, only 7 of the 23 teams were profitable, but wages were still at an all-time high because that was just the cost of doing business at the time. Young, marketable stars like Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Isaiah Thomas, and of course Michael Jordan entering the league in the late 70s and early 80s were a sign of things to come for the growing NBA. So owners were willing to invest in the NBA early, knowing that a growing game with young, marketable stars would pay dividends on the back end. In reality, sometimes you really do just gotta spend money to make money. So what does all this mean for the WNBA, you might ask? Now feels like a good time to remind everyone that the NBA is the majority owner of the WNBA and could, with the stroke of a pen, raise things like vet minimums, the rookie wage scale, and all that stuff without even taking a drop out of the bucket that is the money that they make. But they don't, because growing the W is just not a priority for the NBA. There is no rival women's basketball league in the US that's willing to pay more like the ABA did back in the 70s. Realistically, none of the international teams can afford to go toe toe-to-toe with the giant that is the NBA. And on top of that, WNBA players make a comfortable enough living, especially at the top end. And at the end of the day, they are basketball players. So what they really want to be doing is playing basketball during the time they have, instead of being forced to become like labor rights activists. So at this point, I can already hear people crying about, wah, they get paid more if they just generated more money. Wah, I'm a little baby. Wah. Yeah, that's you. That's how you sound right now. But like I said earlier, the actual amount of money the league makes is irrelevant to this conversation, because it's not about the amount of money that the league makes. It's about the percentage of that money that goes to the players. And that percentage is so minuscule that the league would have to be doing like 100 times better before the players would even notice it. Earlier, we talked about how most American sports have right around a 50-50 split between players and owners. But in practice, that is not the case for the WNBA. Like, I know a lot of media outlets and press releases like to boast about the 50-50 split that was reached in the 2020 CBA agreement, but the league made it basically impossible for the players to ever see that money. So it's not really in practice a 50-50 split. The WNBA has what is called incremental revenue sharing. So that 50-50 split the league loves to report on only kicks in once the league has hit certain growth targets for the time between the CBA and now. And those growth targets are counted as the previous year's revenue plus 20%, or 120% of the previous year's revenue. So let's just say, for the sake of making this as simple as possible, that WNBA revenue in 2019 was $100 million. So the growth target for 2020 would be $120 million, and then $144 million in 2021, $172.8 million in 2022. And in this hypothetical where revenues are perfectly round numbers, they would need to reach a little over $248.8 million, which is almost 2.5 times the original $100 million figure that we started out with. So you see how it's kind of impossible for revenue sharing to ever kick in the WNBA. If 2019 revenues were $100 million, over the last 5 years, they would have had to increase revenues by almost 250% just to get to the point where they can rev share at 50-50 after that. And even after that, part of their 50% that's supposed to go towards the players, 25% of that goes towards marketing and outreach to make sure that the league continues to hit those growth targets. So they're only getting 75% of 50%. But all that is sort of irrelevant, because the WNBA has obviously not been able to reach the nearly impossible standard set to them to kick in revenue sharing. And according to economist David Berry, WNBA players receive only about 10% of the league's revenue. So the NBA and other owners are taking about 90% of the revenues from the WNBA, and yet they can barely get like a TV deal or like a pregame show for big games. Hell, the league partners like ESPN and TNT barely even mention the WNBA. Now, I'm no big city lawyer, but all of that just seems pretty fucked up if you ask me. If the WNBA revenue was the exact same as what it was last year, this year's #1 overall pick, Caitlyn Clark's $78,000 rookie contract would look closer to a $2.2 million contract. But instead of Caitlyn Clark and countless other WNBA players seeing the benefits of the revenues that they generate, most of that money is just funneled back into the NBA. Which means under the current system, anytime anyone goes out and buys a Caitlyn Clark Indiana Fever jersey or a Angel Reese Chicago Sky jersey, players like Miles Bridges and Josh Giddey see more of a kickback from that than Caitlyn and Angel themselves. And I don't really think I need to describe just how messed up that is on pretty much every level. The WNBA's problem is how the revenues that it generates are divided, not how much or little the league makes. So just forget about ratings, ticket sales, merch sales, TV deals, and all that stuff for just a second. If everything about the WNBA remained the same and the NBA just started treating it like an actual business instead of milking the W for every penny that it has, player salaries would already increase to a level that I don't think anyone would be complaining about. But in reality, all the NBA sees the W as is a way to extract just a few more dollars from fans under the guise of being, you know, the progressive league that really cares about women's sports and growing the women's game, while at the same time being the biggest impediment to growing women's basketball in this country. So why should you care? I get it. Even at the low end, we're talking about $78,000, which is more than most of us make in a year, let's just be honest. But the amount is irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. A wage is still a wage, and exploitation is still exploitation. And anytime someone is making a wage, there's more than likely someone right around the corner looking to fuck them out of it. And just because WNBA players make more than you and I, doesn't mean the NBA should get a free pass to screw them out of the money that they generate. What I'm really trying to say is don't let envy trick you into being against your own self-interest. So yeah, make sure you support your local WNBA team, and if you don't have one, just pick one. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of Indiana Fever fan because Caitlyn Clark. They also have Aaliyah Boston, who was at South Carolina a few years ago. She was the #1 pick last year, actually. So Indiana is going to be probably pretty good. But, you know, there are other teams around the league. If the rest of your sports teams suck and you just want to have like a winner in your life, Las Vegas and New York are basically like 2 all-star teams and will probably be in the finals again next year. Chicago and LA both also had really good drafts. Angel Reese, who a lot of people liked at LSU, going to Chicago. My point is there's a lot of talented players all across the WNBA and they deserve to be compensated properly because 10% of revenues is something you'd expect from like a cartoonishly evil oil baron in like the year 1925, not the NBA, which proclaims itself to be our most progressive and, you know, forward-thinking league. So yeah, hopefully this video can help you next time you hear some dumb stuff on the timeline about how if the WNBA players just like dunk more or something, they get more money. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but at the same time, it's not really that complicated. The NBA should just stop screwing these women over. But yeah, thanks for watching. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, all that fun stuff. And most importantly, have an amazing rest of your day. Okay, bye.